The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. We're really privileged to have Mike Hernandez on our team. Mike works with animation at DreamWorks, and he knows how to create powerful designs in paintings, and that's what this video is all about. Enjoy it.
Hey guys. Welcome to the demo. I'm Mike Hernandez, and today I'm going to show you how I paint a digital landscape painting. Now I should say that this is not a Photoshop tutorial. This is just me showing you how I've come to learn to use another tool in discovering shape, color, and design. It's a supplemental learning tool, and it also helps to improve my plein air painting. So let's get started, and I'll show you how that works for me. So I'm going to be using Photoshop today, and even though I told you guys that this is not a Photoshop tutorial, I am going to use Photoshop as my tool. And most of you have your own tools if you do a digital like Procreate or Sketchbook Pro or any one of those. A lot of them have tools that are very similar to this. And what I'm going to be using is the line tool. And a lot of people have asked me, why do I use the line tool to discover my color and my shape? Because what's great about the line tool is it's graphic. And as a painter, I use a lot of flat brushes. So the line tool is great because it imitates that flat brush tool that I like to use in real life. So it keeps things very graphic, it keeps it simple. So what I'm going to do is open up a new document, create a new document in Photoshop. However you guys create your document is fine. What I do from this point is create a brand new layer. Now here is my photo reference, and the reference I'm going to be using is of a barn that I've painted before using Photoshop, using the line tool. So what I'm going to do is start out with a sketch, and I'm going to sketch the line for this composition. I'm going to create a new layer in a brush. And I'm not going to get too fancy with any of my brushes. I'm going to keep things fairly simple. So what I'm going to do first is start out the sketch by discovering where my horizon line is. Start off with a straight line, and that'll give me a base to start. And when I think about composition, I start to think about all of my angles. I think about my straights and my curves first. So the first thing I want to do is give myself an altitude for this mountaintop, and I want to break my painting into fours. So for every composition, whether I'm painting or whether I'm painting in gouache or I'm painting digitally, I may put down this cross pattern. I should put that on another layer for you guys. Let's do that again. I may put this down, but usually I've got it in my head. You know, I kind of have an imaginary vertical and horizontal for breaking my composition into fours. So what that helps me do is think about my composition in quadrants to make sure that I'm not centered and make sure that I have the right biases going on in the painting. So the first thing I do is I'll give myself a top for this mountain's going to be. And I wouldn't want the mountain to end here, because what it's going to do is it's going to bisection this quadrant in half up here. So then it's going to start to break the painting into even pieces. So what I don't want to do is break that into even pieces. I want to give myself a top of where the mountain is going to be here, and some sort of a gesture for that mountain's design. And then I want to give myself some sort of another curve to let me know where in this quadrant the mountain ends. I also want to give myself other angles, like where the slope of this mountain is going to be, and I can put that pretty close to center if I need to. In a good composition, the first things I think of, the most important aspects of a great composition are going to be my straights against my curves and all my opposing angles. So what you don't want is parallel lines, even spaces, because what that's going to do is that's going to disrupt the rhythm of your composition and the flow for your eye. So I'm going to start putting down all of those angles. I know that my mountain has an angle here. It has that angle here and here. And what I'm trying not to do is I don't want to think about any of those details. I just want to think about the big shapes. Now in Photoshop, you've got all of these layers, and whether you're using a different program, they have layers, I believe, as well. And what's great about these layers is that you can break things up into sections that you can either keep or you can delete, or you can put it on lower opacity so you can see less of that line work if you need to. So that's going to help and give me a base to start my composition. Again, when I sketch, I tend to think mostly in straight lines as I'm sketching. I don't get to the curves and all the other things until the second part of the design. And in a lay-in, you don't want to give yourself too much information. For a lay-in that is meant to be used for an underlay for a painting as a reference, needs to be fairly loose, and it needs to be fairly minimal, just to give yourself some basics. If you give yourself too many lines and too much detail in the lay-in, you're going to be painting by number. And if I need to, I can use my eraser and kind of renegotiate some of my composition, which is something I do want to do. I had accidentally sketched on that line, so I don't need that. So the things that I'm starting to think about now for the purpose of rhythm in my lines is I think about this angle I've got up here and how it relates to the angle I have here and how they oppose each other. And I like that. I like that rhythm because what it isn't doing is it's not creating an evenness where if I had a line that way, I wouldn't want to have a line that way, even though it's not in the sketch, but I wouldn't want that evenness. I want that juxtaposition right here. So that's really nice. So I'm thinking about that angle here. Think about that angle. Now I need to think about how this angle juxtaposes this angle. Well, what's great is this one is a straight here. This one I think of as a curve. And as I think of it as a curve, I'm going to put a little bit more of an angle on it so to make sure that that is going to be different than that. And all of these things do matter. They matter in the end. Your viewer is going to be able to feel it even though you don't think it's substantial. It really is. So again, I'm going to push that angle more extreme. And now I can see that this angle is opposing that angle very nicely. You want to spend some time in the beginning of your composition to make sure that all of these things feel right. You don't want to have this happen to you. You don't want to discover that this was a problem or an issue later in the painting, because what usually ends up happening is if I've got a bad design and I got a bad lay-in, I find that the only way I'm trying to correct it is I'm trying to do too much color and too much lighting to try to make it more visually appealing. And in the end, I'll realize, oh shoot, I didn't get my composition and my design right, and that there's something else wrong. And it was never the color, it was never the lighting, it was never the rendering, it was that the design and the composition wasn't solid. It's like a good home, a solid foundation. You can't build a great house unless it has a proper foundation to it. No matter how many great bricks you put on it or all the color you paint on it, and all the finishes, it's not going to hold together if the foundation isn't sound. And for me, I think of that same exact principle when I'm thinking of a composition. It has to be solid before I do any painting. Now what I do is I like to think of the positive and the negative shapes of what's in light and what's in shadow. So most people tend to think of the things that are in light, but those are those positive shapes. A lot of people tend to actually look at the negative shapes without even knowing it. So what's mostly not there? What's mostly here is shadow. There's more shadow than there is sunlight. So what we're doing is we're actually looking at what's mostly not there. So if I had a blank piece of white paper and I put a dot there, someone would argue that, well, there's mostly white, so are we looking at the white or are we looking at that little black dot that's on the paper? Well, chances are, more than likely, your eyes are anchored to what's mostly not there, that little black dot. The same applies to the narrative of lighting. So if I'm lighting this mountain and it is mostly in shadow with hardly any light, our eyes are looking at that light because it's what's hardly there. But our eyes are also secondary to the other shapes that support it. So I make my eyes go to looking at the shape of sunlight on this mountain, what shape that actually makes. And then my eyes look at the shapes of the shadows. What shape is this gigantic shape, to this other shape? And I break all my shapes down into hierarchies of small, medium, large, and then the fine little accent details. So for me, this shadow shape right here is my giant shape. That's my large. And this one here is a medium. And then there's ones over here that could be like my small shadow shapes. And these would be a couple of small shadow shapes. Small, medium, and large. Those are the three most important shapes to break down in the shape vocabulary. The rest of them are going to be other shapes like these really small things we don't need to get into right now. Those things we'll get into when we go into painting. We'll discover those. But just to indicate that there will be some small shadow shapes up there is good enough. Okay, good. That's evolving. I think it's looking really good. I don't have to put too much more information into the background because I'm going to discover a lot of that as I lay in and do color blocking. But I also want to make sure I've got these planes correct. I want to make sure that this foreshortening builds volume in the painting, but it needs to build volume in the line before I put any value on it. So this distance from here to here is a short foreshortening. It could be the same distance in reality from here to here, but because it goes so far back, it collapses and goes smaller. So I have to have a small, then slightly bigger, and then a much larger move here. That's really critical. So I'm going to make sure that I spend a little bit of time in getting that right. So there is a small foreshortened shape here to a medium shape here, and then a large movement all the way to the foreground. That's going to give, just by the line in and of itself, that mountain a lot of volume, and it'll follow through in the painting once we put lighting and shadow on it. I also want to make sure as this plane comes down, it meets this shadow, and that's where we roll up and sweeps across. On the photo, it's very straight, but I like having that angle here because I like to oppose that shape against that shape over here. Then that wraps around and drops in, and then you have a sliver of a valley of light here, so I want to drop that curve a little bit lower. Now let's just clean this up a little bit. Let's get a better area. Now normally I use my larger Cintiq tablet when I'm in my studio, but for now I'm going to be using my Wacom tablet. The Wacom tablet, it's a little bit disconnected from the screen if you're used to using a Cintiq, but if you're trained on the Wacom, it's going to be kind of second nature to you and it'll work just fine. So I started out using the Wacom tablet like this, so I'm fairly used to it, but I also do use the Cintiq when I'm in my studio. So when you use the Cintiq, it's a little more intuitive because you're sketching right on the screen, which makes it a lot easier. So the Wacom tablet is slightly disconnected, but once we get into the line tool, it's going to be fairly intuitive. I'm going to renegotiate the composition size to get a little bit more of that mountain out there. So I recropped so we could sketch out just a little bit farther. I want more of that mountain. So then another thing I want to do is I want to push these shapes a little more. So this is pretty accurate to what's going on in the photo. And now what I want to do is I want to play around a little bit with pushing and pulling some of those shapes. So this is the lasso tool. It's a selection tool. And what I'm going to do is make a selection over that part of my sketch right there. I'm going to hide the selection, and I just do that with Command H. And then we use what's called the transform. So you go to Edit, and Photoshop has a few different ways to transform. I'm going to use Edit Transform, and I'm going to use Distort. And you can grab these anchor points and you can distort the line. So I want that gesture of the mountain shape to push a little bit harder up because I really want to emphasize the gesture of that mountain. So I can renegotiate it by taking that line and pushing on it. I can also have sketched it as well, but now it kind of gives you a little sense. Oops. Do that one more time. Edit, transform, warp, and oh, it's not that either. I lost my selection. Give me a second. There we go. Transform, warp. So that just gives that mountain that lean that I want it to get. There's a nice big overall gesture of the mountain, and I'm trying to emphasize the lean of that mountain a little bit more than it really is. I want to get the backrest of that and correct it. That nice curve up here. Now here's another thing I need to pay attention to is both sides of this painting, if I draw a line all the way across, let's do that on the other layer, I'm going to notice that I'm starting here and I'm ending on the same level. So that's something I need to correct. So I'm going to go back over here and erase that part. And I'm going to raise it up just a little bit higher. So the mountain ends much higher up here. And this is going to end lower. I'm going to put my horizon line just a little bit lower. What I like about this composition is the proportion of land to mountain. And the mountain in this piece, it just becomes your curtain, your backdrop, and your stage for setting up the stage for this barn that's going to sit right in front of it. It's just the curtain behind it. But what's nice about it is you've got the weight and you've got that grand scope and scale of a big, large mountain sitting on top of a much smaller line. What would really ruin this composition is if I decided to have the horizon or where the barn would sit a little bit higher up here, dividing this much mountain to that much land. The mind always functions on levels of hierarchy, and it wants you to decide for it what's more important to you. Is there more mountain? Is there more ground? So for me, just putting that horizon as low as I possibly can and giving that mountain as much elevation as I can is going to be great. So that's the sketch for the mountain in the background. I can leave that alone for now. And I'm going to go into the sketch for the barn. So I'm going to create another layer over the mountain. And I'm going to put this on a lower opacity, the one in the background. So it's fairly faint. And on the layer for the barn, we'll do a sketch of the barn real quickly. So again, what's nice about Photoshop is I can start roughing in something that's fairly approximate to what the barn will be. And then when I feel like that barn feels right to me, I can put that layer on a lower opacity to where it's almost a bit of a ghost of a sketch. Do another layer over that, and this time I'll do a cleaner version of that barn. And what I do is I hold down the Shift key with my sketch and I can get straight lines. The other thing I can do is I have to turn off my shape dynamics and my transfers, and you can tap on a corner and then hold down Shift, and you can get straight lines that way as well. I also need to pay attention to perspective because this barn has a vanishing point in perspective. The vanishing point for this one is way off the page. It goes somewhere way out on the horizon, far left. So I want to kind of imagine that those perspecting lines have a little bit of perspective. So that one should tilt down just a little bit. This next line should tilt up just a hair, and then the top should tilt even more, so that way I get that sense of perspective on the barn that it's vanishing. So it's going to give the barn some volume, and it'll also make it feel like it belongs to that composition because it has a sense of depth to it. Can't be too flat. Now, even though I'm using straight lines, at some point I want some character to this barn, so I'm going to come back in and we're going to play with some of the lines in that barn. One of the ways I can do that, I can show you how to do that using the warp tool. So the warp tool, you can go into Edit, Transform, and there, well, we won't use that. We'll go Image, Filter, sorry. Liquify. And Filter Liquify will help you push those pixels around, which is really great. So you take this warp tool, it's just a push warp tool, and I'm going to make a larger brush. And I want to make sure my pressure is just a little bit lower so it doesn't push it too hard. Because if the pressure is all the way up and I warp, it's going to do something that's too extreme. And I'm going to restore that. But if I go much lighter with the pressure, it's going to let me push that in a softer density. So I'm just trying to give this barn a little bit of character. But the other thing I'm trying to do for the barn is I'm trying to give it a little bit of weight. Now, I want to make sure that this barn feels very substantial. And the way to do that is to make it feel like in the composition, it's been there for a long time. And it's not just a toy barn, but it's a massive, heavy, real, barn that weighs tons. And the roof probably weighs about a ton. And in order to do that, what would happen in real life is these roof lines would kind of sag from the weight of itself. And sometimes getting snow loads or wind loads, these lines of the roof would start to give in a little bit. Even the top of the roof would have a little bit of a sag to it. So that's going to make the barn feel more substantial. I'm also going to put a little bit of a lean on that barn. Have this wall camber out just a little bit, and that wall camber out just a little bit as well. It's going to make it feel like it's heavier and it's settling into the earth. In this digital video, you can expect to learn a little bit more about how you can stylize color and learn color mixing and how it can be a supplement to your plein air painting. There's also a lot to be learned about the design and how to make shapes of color and how to make shapes of light much more interesting. The most exciting part about this video for me is discovering color and discovering colors that you normally wouldn't discover quite as quickly in plein air painting. I mean, in using Photoshop as a tool, there's an immediacy and you got a little bit more control and more variability in the application. So I'm excited that I'm able to experiment and take more risks and be more bold. What this video offers that's unique is the ability to mix color intuitively in the digital format. Because normally when you're using digital paint, things tend to be much more mechanical, so it's harder for you to learn color theory and it's harder to learn how to mix color in the computer. But through the method I'm going to be teaching and using in this workshop, you'll be able to mix more intuitively like you would with real paint. So hopefully this digital demo will teach you a little something about how you can use another tool to your advantage. You know, for me as an artist, I use many tools. You know, some of it is plein air painting, some of it is sketching with real paint, and then some of it is in the computer, and some of it is actually even in sculpting. Sometimes I use sculpting to understand my form. Other tools I use as well is studying other people's art. So for me, Photoshop and the digital medium is just another tool I'm going to use and how to enhance color and design shape and think about how I can play around with experimenting with colors and experimenting with layers and taking more risks. So hopefully that works for you as well.
Well, that was Design Powerful Paintings with Mike Hernandez. And you can learn more about the full video at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, you can get a special discount for today only for this viewing, and you can find it in the comments section. Now, let's get right to our interview with Mike Hernandez.
So I hope you guys learned a lot about color and how it can lend itself to your plein air, and maybe even how it lends itself to the digital work that you're going to be doing. But that's about as far as I'm going to take this painting. And for now, if there's any questions, I can take them.
All right, do we have any questions in the live audience? Cool, we're going to get to some questions that we have coming in online.
Yes.
We have a question from Steve who says, could you define hierarchy and its use in painting?
Absolutely. The brain, the mind, everything in life functions on levels of hierarchy. If it didn't, we'd trip and we wouldn't know the difference between what's in front and what's in back of things. We wouldn't know how to navigate through life. So what happens is our mind has to have something to choose. It needs to be able to favor something. For example, when it comes to color, the eyes have what are called rods and cones in them. And those rods and cones can only focus on one hierarchy at a time, meaning if you had red and you had green and they were both at the same intensity, your brain needs nature or you to make a decision as to which one it's supposed to look at. Because if it doesn't, the rods and cones can only function on one thing at any given time. And so what's going to happen is, you've ever seen that happen, those two colors start to vibrate. And that's the mind not knowing where to go. So the same applies to detail and the landscape. If you were to go to the Grand Canyon and you went out to that rim, well, you're able to all at one time take in the scope and the scale and the enormity of that whole landscape. And you're seeing it for what it is on a grand scale. But for you to then initially go in and pinpoint areas and appreciate them, like, oh, I love that tree down there, or that distant rock, or the Colorado River way down below, or I see donkeys making their way up the trails, or the cracks in the rocks over here. You can do that one by one by one. It's impossible for your mind to inherently take in all of those details simultaneously at the same time. We're not built that way. We're built to kind of take it in hierarchy of what's most important, what's second, and what's third. So that's what I mean by color hierarchy as well. If we painted this painting and I put the same amount of saturation in other parts of the painting, your eye doesn't know where it wants you to go. And what's going to happen is it's going to flatten out and it's going to want to leave the painting. So I build everything on hierarchies. There's color hierarchy, where I want your eye to look most. And when I say color hierarchy, sometimes it's not just the saturation, but it's the contrast of one color versus another. So for example, this painting was mostly in the blue-violet, and then it had that red punch. Towards the end of the painting, you'll notice I started glazing a lot of greens. The reason I glazed a lot of those yellow lime greens in the background is what I was trying to do is not only kind of build a sense of harmony in the painting, but I wanted that red barn in the foreground to have something to pop off of. And so the opposite of that red is those greens that are in the background. So you get that little subtle hint. I didn't have to go literal, strong, vivid green for the background, but I wanted some of that background color field to have little hints of green in it. That way it can start pushing that red barn forward. But the hierarchy is there. It's a smaller piece of a very saturated red to a much bigger field of a lot of desaturated other colors that seem to harmonize together. So hopefully that answers your question on color hierarchy.
Great. Susie's asking, why did you use blocks/rectangles? Is it just because you like that shape?
I love building on rudimentary shapes. You know, for me, I try not to think of detail when I start painting. You know, and teaching this for such a long time, I notice even myself when I was younger, as well as my students, they like to go into detail right away. They start articulating the small shapes, and like a sculptor, it's always great to start with your massive shapes, and then you start to take away from those things. So the line tool, it's a nice basic shape. It keeps things graphic, it keeps it simple, and for me it's always simple. If I get a round shape and it's going to start to make a lot of complex shapes, I like to think of that towards the end of the painting as opposed to the beginning. I think in what is the most basic vocabulary I can use to start my painting and to start my shape making. So I like to break it down into blocks that way.
All right. We have a technical question from Marnie. Marnie asks, can Photoshop elements achieve similar results to this workshop?
That is a good question. I'm not as familiar with Photoshop elements. Hopefully they would have a line tool in there that you can use. If not, you should be able to use like a square paintbrush, and one way to do it, it may be a little bit slower of a process, but you would be able to tap and then hold the shift button and then tap somewhere else, and that should create a straight line for you to use. But the hope is you could find some kind of a program that allows you to create simple building blocks. It doesn't have to be the line tool. The line tool just happens to be the tool of my choice. I know there's a lot of people who do use a lot of square brushes, but they keep it square and they tap down and they go up and down between large, medium, and small shapes. It depends on what you're comfortable with. You need to experiment with that media that you're using, whether it be a Procreate or Elements. Find the tool in there that makes it rudimentary, makes it simple, and makes it as basic as possible for you to build on. You don't want to go into complex tool making in the beginning.
Perfect. Tamara asks about file size of the finished digital painting files. Are they large in size? Do you compress them to save the file?
Let's see what I got now. Let's go to my image size. So this one right now at 13 by 16, oh, I'm sorry, that's the photo. Let's go the wrong one here. File, image size. Yeah, at 300 DPI, 14 by 15, and in pixels. This is pretty high at 4K at least, you know, 4200 width and height. I think that's a really good file size. For me, it depends on your computer. I can save a high-res progressive JPEG at this size, but I tend to like to save, you know, my PSD files as is. I wouldn't compress it from this size. I don't have a lot of files, a lot of layers, I'm sorry, compared to maybe some of the layers I'll use when I'm working in the industry. If I'm doing a painting that's meant to be kind of a matte painting or a real heavy painting that's a city scene, I've been known to have as many as like 400 or 300 layers in a file, and it's just absolutely crazy. You know, I have files for, like, you know, the windows, for the highlights on the windows and the shadows, because sometimes I know that other people on the show I'm working on in the industry, they might want to borrow those files and reuse some of those elements. But generally speaking, I'll save, if If I need to at work, I save it as high as I possibly can, at least 4K and up. But at this one here, I don't have that many layers. I feel like I went as high as 24, 24, 25, 27, under 30 layers isn't a lot. I probably could have done it with less. And a lot of times, if I'm not being procedural and I'm not teaching, sometimes I'll do a line drawing that maybe only has 1 or 2 layers, and I'll just kind of go for it and use the line tool all the way through. But for the purposes of this demo, I wanted you to see how you could take advantage of layering, and you can paint behind objects and over objects, but it's not necessary. You could do the whole thing in line tool on 1 layer if you wanted to, realistically.
Citra asks, how do you bring the digital colors back into harmony? I tend to overmix when using RGB slider. The colors seem lost.
Yeah. That tool I used at the very end, the filter, which was in the filter gallery, I think it was Cutout. Cutout is a nice way to kind of bring things back if you've gone too far and you overmixed. So yeah, it's an excellent question, because you're going to find that when you use those RGB sliders, what tends to happen is you will get a lot more color than you're used to getting. So for people who don't get enough color, the RGB sliders are going to be fantastic. But then you're going to get to a place where you're like, well, I got way too much color because, yeah, I want a little. What happened is you were overdoing the slider relationships. You only need to sometimes nudge them a little bit to kind of discover color. And if you went too far with a painting, don't worry about it. If it's not for a project, if it's not for work, it's for your discovery, then that's great. Don't worry about it. Just continue to mix, and then you'll learn how to bring the colors a little closer together in other areas and a lot bigger in some areas. But the Cutout tool, you can see right now what it's done to this file. It's given me a simplified version of what I had. No, that didn't do that. Let's see. Let me do that one more time. Flatten that and go back to the filter gallery. And I'm going to show you a simplified version. Now, it helps to have a higher resolution, so that way the cutout can cut out a lot more distinct patterns. But I like doing this because it's going to get rid of a lot of, like, this is what I have, and if that feels too complex, I can do this at 100% with the layer above it after doing Cutout. And then I can use transparency and kind of say, well, how much more of the color I had before do I want to bring forward? Let's say you liked everything in the highlights. I can double tap this layer, and this represents the value range of the layer I have now. This represents all the layers underneath. So if I wanted to say, like, I like what it did to the shadows, it simplified them, but I wanted to keep the complexity I have in the highlight, this is the highlights of all the layers underneath. So I can subtract that from my layer and bring back just the highlights. And then if I use the Option button, I can split that and feather it out. So that way I can keep my highlights. But what it did is it simplified my shadows. So yes, it's good to come back with a bigger brush. What happens is if you make your line tool very small and you're doing a lot of small moves and a lot of mixing with small brush lines, it's going to get very busy and too colorful. So when that happens, like I did, I came back here before I did all these color blends, and I made a big brush again. I took a big brush and I grabbed 2 or 3 colors and I simplified some of the bigger, broader shapes. You don't want a lot of color variety on those big shapes, especially in the shadows. You're going to want most of that variety in the brightest part of your highlights where all the texture is. You can express texture with all that color movement. And then in the shadows, if you want that to be quieter, you do less color, less relationships. Keep those relationships very simple. You notice I hardly put any relationships in the snow. I had 1, 2, 3 simple planes of color, and that was it. The sky, I left it the way it was in the lay-in, just a couple of simple shapes, because there's hardly that much sky up there. I left the complexity for the mountains and the barn. But yeah, it's nice that you asked that question, because I was able to come back and I was able to use the Cutout tool to maybe simplify some of my shadows. See what I'm doing here? It simplified the barn a little too much. I'm going to erase what it did there and bring back the barn. But look what it did to my shadows here. It kind of quieted some of those areas down, so it's not too contrasty. So it's a good question. Thank you.
All right, we have just a couple more. We have Diane wants to know, how can I develop the skills where I can edit my references the way you do?
Painting from life. Absolutely. Paint from life as much as you can. Sketch from life, draw from life, and that's where all your answers come in. For me, this is a secondary supplemental tool. It's only valuable because I've learned most of what I already know from outdoor painting. And if I already know that, then I'm going to be able to come in and look at a photograph and I'm going to be able to manipulate it. So there's a couple of things you could do. Painting and drawing from life, that's where life lessons are more valuable than anything. And then you need to kind of decide, well, what is it you're trying to do beyond the photo reference that you're looking at? For me, it's all about that imagination. Since I work in the entertainment industry and I work in animation, it's all about storytelling. So I spend a lot of time recreating worlds and stylizing worlds. So that kind of helps and build a little bit of muscle memory for stylization and pushing shapes and finding a vocabulary for the style of a film and how it relates to the type of story I'm telling, to the theme, to the mood, and to the character, the style of the character. I know how to develop worlds on that. But if you're developing, you're trying to look at a reference and say, well, I'm not doing anything in animation. I'm just trying to see how I can maybe, as a contemporary artist, as a fine artist, I want to know how I can push those things. Again, a lot of that stuff happens from life and sketching from life, studying the masters, and looking at, some of the older classical masters versus some of our more recent masters and how they push and pull on shape, how they push and pull on color is going to help you. Doing master studies, sketching and painting from life, and then it doesn't hurt to look at what the guys in entertainment and in animation or in live action, what they're doing, because they learned all of those things, not just from animation, but all these amazing things you're seeing with stylization and color and light, how they're pushing and pulling on those things don't just come from film and entertainment. They come from the masters before film, from other artists and doing what it is they do, and current artists as well. So hopefully that answers your question somehow.
All right, now this is a kind of simpler question. Can you show the finished painting full screen?
Absolutely.
So that folks at home can see it a little bit bigger.
There we go. Hopefully that helps. Is that full screen? Let me open the navigator and I think I can get it just a little bit bigger. Get rid of those. Did I just get rid of the navigator? Probably did. Yeah. No, I think that's got to be it right there. Yeah, it's about as big as it goes. There's going to be a lot of things I discover about this painting, as I stare at it for a little while. So again, that's also a good lesson for you guys as you're doing this on your own. It's good to take those breaks. It's good to step away. As a plein air painter, we do it all the time. I'm at an easel and I'm painting something, and then I have to step away and I have to back away from my painting. That's why the easel is really great. The danger of working digitally sometimes is instead of zooming in on something, we tend to do this and we bring our head really close to the screen. You'll know that you're doing that quite a bit and you have to catch yourself. You want at least 2 feet from the screen, if not more. I think it's healthy to be like 3 feet away from your screen, and you have to be conscious about zooming in instead of you bringing your head in. Always keep your posture upright because it's not good for you anyway. We get that hyperextended thing in our neck if we're always doing this. So always keep your posture up and back, and then make sure you're zooming in on your subject and you're not pulling your head forward. But also make sure that you're taking breaks and you are stepping away, literally stepping away from the painting. Fill screen like I've just done. Step away and look at it from a distance and see what you can see. And then also flipping the painting like I was doing many times. It's good to flip the painting and look at it with a fresh eye, because if you remember when I did that, I discovered certain proportions that were challenging others. And that'll help in me rediscovering how to bring back a lot of that variety. For those who paint plein air, we do the same thing, and I think I talked about this earlier, which is we're at our easel and we're painting, and we usually like to have a mirror the exact opposite of where we're painting, so we could look at the mirror and see the image flipped as well. So that also helps.
All right, one final question.
Yes.
Deborah asks, do you glaze your gouache paintings with those same flat strokes?
It's harder to glaze your gouache because it reactivates when you wet it again. This is something that's a lot easier to do when you use an acrylic or when you use oils. So if you're an oil painter, once your painting has been dried in the studio, you'll do a lot of glazing possibly like this to start discovering how that works. Or if you need it to happen faster, you paint with acrylic, and once that acrylic's dry, you can glaze right over it again. It's a little harder to do, to be honest with you, when you're using gouache because it's gonna reactivate. Do I do it and have I done it? Yes, I have, but it's a real, very careful technique, and you can only afford to maybe do one brush stroke at a time. But when you're doing it, if you want to glaze a certain part of your gouache, you have to mix up enough water, and it's got to be very transparent, and you want to swim one stroke over that area and not do it again, because if you overwork that stroke or if you press too hard and not have enough water, it's going to smear the paint underneath and it's going to reactivate it. Moreover, for me, when I do this in Photoshop and I start to understanding all of these beautiful color relationships that I've discovered, I paint it that way opaquely in gouache. At the end of my painting, I just start to build in some variation based on what I've learned both from outdoors, but also what I've learned digitally. It's not as if I'm learning something brand new here for myself, since, like I said, I've learned most of these things outdoors, and most of what I'm doing here is because I've learned to paint outdoors. But this helps to reinforce it. Again, it's just very supplemental to what it is I already do. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Well, that was Mike Hernandez from Design Powerful Paintings. He can help you design powerful paintings in this video. The full video is available at lilyartvideo.com. And today only, there's a special discount code in the comments section. Take advantage of that while you can. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
In this digital video, you can expect to learn a little bit more about how you can stylize color and learn color mixing and how it can be a supplement to your plein air painting. There's also a lot to be learned about the design and how to make shapes of color and how to make shapes of light much more interesting. The most exciting part about this video for me is discovering color and discovering colors that you normally wouldn't discover quite as quickly in plein air painting. I mean, in using Photoshop as a tool, there's an immediacy, and you get a little bit more control and more variability in the application. So I'm excited that I'm able to experiment and take more risks and be more bold. What this video offers that's unique is the ability to mix color intuitively in the digital format. Because normally when you're using digital paint, things tend to be much more mechanical, so it's harder for you to learn color theory, and it's harder to learn how to mix color in the computer. But through the method I'm going to be teaching and using in this workshop, you'll be able to mix more intuitively like you would with real paint. So hopefully this digital demo will teach you a little something about how you can use another tool to your advantage. You know, for me as an artist, I use many tools. You know, some of it is plein air painting, some of it is sketching with real paint, and then some of it is in the computer, and some of it is actually even in sculpting. Sometimes I use sculpting to understand my form. Other tools I use as well is studying other people's art. So for me, Photoshop and the digital medium is just another tool I'm going to use and how to enhance color and design shape and think about how I can play around with experimenting with colors and experimenting with layers and taking more risks. So hopefully that works for you as well.